6:04 sentencing today for the second teen convicted in the death of a Rochester man 2 years ago. Adriel Riley was convicted of murder and arson in the death of Stephen Amenhauser.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of What Were They Thinking? True Crime Podcast. I'm your host, Philip Tommaso. Hello. Today is Monday, April 24th. We are on our 10th episode of What Were They Thinking? True Crime Podcast. 10 episodes in, kind of a mile marker for myself. Today's not going to be an extremely long episode, but it is a terribly difficult episode. The situation I'm about to recount is horrific. It is horrific. Burned alive is what it is called. It's the death of Stephen Amenhauser. The details, limited as they are, as I indicated, are horrific. There's no other word. And upsetting. Horrific and upsetting. I do caution listeners ahead of time. The research I have done is nothing short of disturbing. It was March 12th, 2021, a crisp end of winter kind of day. Temperatures did climb into the low 50s, but then quickly dropped down to 28 degrees as we're approaching the first day of spring that year. There was mostly clear skies, and it was still kind of blustery. Winds ranged from 10 to 30 miles per hour, with gusts hitting 44 miles per hour. Just to give you a sense of setting, and this is taking place in Rochester, New York. 53-year-old Stephen Carl Amenhauser sat inside his apartment, which was located at 500 and a half Lyle Avenue, not far from where I work, not far from where I grew up, and not far from where I currently live. Stephen, who was originally from Texas, was also adopted. He lived alone. His wife had passed away many years ago, and his longtime girlfriend had passed away in the previous October in 2020. The man was truly alone with no surviving family. Stephen was also in declining health, and he had found himself in a very vulnerable position at this point in his life. On that Friday, March 12th, at around 12:28 in the afternoon, two people snuck into Stephen's apartment. They doused the widower in a flammable liquid, and then they lit him on fire. While on fire, Stephen fled from his apartment and ran outside. Someone passing by saw Stephen on fire and used their own jacket to put the fire out. Stephen, regardless, suffered second and third degree burns to over 70% of his body. Two teenagers were accused of this deplorable and vicious attack and the eventual death of Stephen Amenhauser. Zavian Perry was 16 years old at the time and living on Arnett Boulevard in the city of Rochester. He was the older of the two involved in the crime. Yes, the older at 16. The second teenager apprehended was 14-year-old Adriel Riley Jr., who lived on Grover Street, also located in the city of Rochester, and both addresses are just a heartbeat away from the town of Gates, which borders the city of Rochester. And I mention that only because it comes into play a little bit later in this episode. I believe, due to the ages of the suspects, there's very little available for public research. Like everything I've tried to find, I think a lot of it's just kept under, that because they're minors. Yeah. So I did as much research as possible on this and followed the story as closely as I could. Considering youth and juvenile courts were involved, I think there's a lot of lock and key going on documents sealed, or I don't know. Not too much is out there. All I know is I've struggled to get my hands on much of anything. Regardless, I'm going to do my best to put together the information I did collect and present a clearer, or as clear a picture as possible for everyone listening. I think the best way to go about breaking this down is to first discuss the suspects and what they went through, and then give you as much as I can about the victim and the man he once was. Rochester police investigator Nicholas Mazzola claimed that the two teens entered Stephen's apartment. They dispersed the flammable liquid onto Stephen while he sat in his chair, and also onto the floor around him, and then they used a lighter and lit the victim on fire. Witnesses easily identified the teens at the scene of the crime. One person stated to the news crews that it was like 10 cops out there, and the fire department, and technician units. I thought somebody got killed. Someone being set on fire? That's really like crazy. I wondered why it was, and a lot of people still have unanswered questions. Why did it happen? Why'd you do this? People were shocked, to say the least. Stephen Carl Amenhauser had been rushed to Strong Memorial Hospital, the Kessler Burn and Trauma Center within Strong Memorial. It's renowned across the country for the remarkable work they do there and the staff that attends to the patients brought in. The Gates Police Department was very familiar with both Xavion and Adriel, or we'll just call them Perry and Riley. Much easier to pronounce. Perry being the older one, Riley being the 14-year-old, as well as being familiar with their parents. They immediately contributed to the city of Rochester's police investigation. The Gates Police Department did. Gates Police Chief James, I'm going to mispronounce this, James Van Brederode, told Spectrum News his officers have had run-ins with both teens prior to their arrests for dousing Stephen in flammable fluid and setting him on fire. I don't know that I can say that enough. According to the Gates chief, in September 2020, 14-year-old Riley robbed a deaf person at knife point and then was charged with the felony. That same night, the night the Gates police said Riley's mother then rented the 14-year-old a hotel room for him and his friends. And then she was arrested and charged with endangering the welfare of a child. See what you might not be picking up on. 14-year-old Riley robbed a deaf person at knife point and was charged with a felony. But he didn't go to jail. They get let out in New York State. They get appearance tickets and have to show up for court later. Does that make any sense? Does that make any sense at all? So he gets his parents called, or someone comes and picks him up from the police station with his appearance ticket. If he even went to the police station, sometimes they just get the appearance ticket right there and they're let to walk free. And so then his mother rents him a hotel room. I don't understand that, but she rents him a hotel room for him and his friends. A reward? Am I being facetious? Am I being sarcastic? Kind of, but not really. So then in January 2021, both Perry and Riley were caught in a stolen car. Both times the teens were released back into the custody of their parents. So you got the knife point robbery, stolen cars. No one's doing any time. No one's really getting in trouble. You basically have a hand slap, if that, with your appearance ticket. That's New York State. That's New York State for you. However, let's keep going here. Riley's father, Adriel Riley Sr., and Lakia Lee, Perry's mother, were charged by the Gates police because they did not know their children's whereabouts when they were arrested for the stolen car. Because of the hour that they were picked up, the parents did have to hold some accountability because their teens were out stealing cars. The parents pled not guilty to endangering the child of a welfare. Of course they did. Normally, I don't tend to hold parents responsible for the acts committed by their children. These are teenagers, uh, clearly seasoned hoodlums, and the parents were absolutely aware. And maybe as parents, they just had no control over the depraved teens, maybe. But eventually, at some point, someone has to be held responsible. Van Brederode stated, because we don't want the pipeline right to Attica, but the way the current system is, it's terrible. And what we have now in Rochester is an event that is absolutely horrendous, and it was totally avoidable had the juvenile justice system had proper precautions in place. Obviously, the chief of police for Gates is upset that somebody got burned alive who by teens who shouldn't be on the street, shouldn't have still been loose on the streets with no place in a community. Never. So despite the excellent care Stephen did receive at the hospital, he died 4 days later on Tuesday, March 16th at around 4:08 a.m. This vicious attack, the arson assault, had now become a homicide. So once brought in for questioning, both Perry and Riley Jr. admitted their role in the violence committed against Stephen. In April, both Perry and Riley Jr. pleaded not guilty to charges of murder in the second-degree arson and criminal possession of a weapon. So they admitted it when they were being questioned, and then they pled not guilty for their actions. In the courtroom, 16-year-old Perry and 14-year-old Riley Jr. showed little to no emotion as the charges against them were read out loud. Now, I have to be honest, I'm not sure if they were physically in the courtroom or on like a legal Zoom for the thing. I kind of got mixed things in the thing, mixed information in what I dug up. I believe it was a Zoom thing, not in person. However, either way, the teens showed no emotion for the charges being read against them. Their lawyer claimed neither of the teens were a potential risk flight or a flight risk. Yeah, their lawyer claimed that neither of the teens were a potential flight risk, and he asked for bail to be set at a reasonable amount. Although the district attorney wanted bail set at $1 million per teen due to what he called the horrific nature of the crime, the judge cut the request in half. Perry's bail was $500,000 and Riley Jr.'s bail was set at $500,000. The district attorney indicated the two teens could face up to life in prison for their sickening crimes. That at least is the best part. In January 2022, Perry did plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter for his part in Amenhauser's death. And on Tuesday, February 28th of this year, 2023, a criminal youth part and family court judge convicted Perry of 2 felonies for the vicious murder of Stephen Amenhauser. And this was a bench trial. A bench trial means there's no jury. The judge listens to the facts, the testimony, reviews the evidence, and then renders his decision. It's all up to him. I can't imagine if a jury was there and had to listen to this stuff. I feel like everything would be 100 times worse. People are fed up. People are fed up with teenagers that are gangsters, that are criminals like this, and getting away with everything that they get away with for so long. They're fed up. Better to have one judge listening, trying the case, and not having a jury decide anyone's fate. Not in this particular case. I wouldn't want a jury. Anyway, give me a minute here. Riley was also found guilty of second-degree murder and second-degree criminal possession of a weapon, both considered felonies. Both were felonies. The assistant district attorney, Rachel Clark, who prosecuted the case with Matthew Shiano, stated that Adriel Riley's violent actions were completely indescribable and inhumane. I mean, that's to say the very least. The district attorney, Sandra Durley, said in a news release that the depraved actions of Adriel Riley, with assistance from Xavion Perry, took the life of Stephen Amenhauser in a terrifying manner. She went on to say, Adriel Riley is a danger to this community as he has no regard for human life. This murder was cruel and devastating. 2 years later, I'm relieved that we're finally able to find justice for Stephen Amenhauser. 2 years later, Perry was in fact sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Now, the sentencing, although convicted for Riley, is continuing, just keeps getting put off. He was supposed to be sentenced in March 28th of this year, and then he didn't, and then he was supposed to be sentenced again, and it's been prolonged. It's been procrastinated. He will get sentenced, and he is facing 15 years to life, which is asinine. Because 15 years, which means, I believe, like in 7 years, he could be up for parole. It's because of his age. Because of this 14-year-old. You know, you don't want to lock somebody away forever for something they might have done, but that doesn't take into account, that rule doesn't take into account what this kid, what this teenager, what this man has actually done. Again, that is New York for you. So he's going to be sentenced. He's been convicted, but he is going to be sentenced. Riley's mother, Latara Wilson, blindly contends, my son could never do anything like this. He's a teenage kid, and I could never fathom the thought of him doing this because he doesn't have it in his nature to do it. This is all well and good if, let's say, Riley Jr. had never been in trouble before, but her contentions fall on these deaf ears. Her son is a dangerous menace, and what sucks, what absolutely sucks, is because of his age at the time of the crime. Okay, that's enough about Perry and Riley Jr. Talking about them this much makes my stomach just churn. It gets my anxiety boiling. I consider them both soulless, heartless, loveless wastes. I do. I can only hope that the two are never released from prison, that parole is continually denied. I think about this because Stephen Amenhauser didn't have any family, no surviving family. He was it. He was all on his own. I only hope at parole hearings in the future there's someone there to remind the parole board specifically of what was done. You always hear about that when there's parole hearings. The family of the victims go and they are witness to the proceedings that the parole board then has to take into consideration. There's no one to do that for this man. This man was on his own. That's what troubles me. That's what troubles me. So I hope somebody can prevent these two from getting out on parole ever. They don't deserve that second chance at freedom, whether it's 7 years, 15 years, 25 years from now. I don't care how old they are going into prison. What they did is just so heinous. It's unfathomable. Unfathomable. Okay. Anyway, Stephen Amenhauser, he's dead because they killed him. His life was cut short, violently, and prematurely. Let's talk a little bit about him, just to calm things down, because I know I'm riled up. So Stephen, I learned, was kind, caring, gentle, and soft-spoken. The Rochester Police Locust Club organized the funeral along with the Catholic diocese because there was no one to do this for him. There was no one to do this for him. But the Rochester Police Locust Club and the Catholic diocese handled his funeral. hundreds of people showed up for his funeral services. It was at Holy Apostle Church located on Austin Street in Rochester, New York. It was filled, the church was filled to capacity. Even the bishop was there. Bishop Salvatore Matano spoke at the ceremony saying, in this tragic event, we must ask ourselves, how did we fail those who committed such an egregious act? The priest, Father Magavaro, said, our brother Stephen was suddenly and violently taken from us. The manner of his death leaves us breathless, shaken, and stunned. Three close friends, or closer friends of Stephen, spoke with Spectrum News after the service. Glenn Ridley said, when I first met Steve, I noticed right away he's one of those meek people, a kind, gentle man. Christina Mullen had this to say, I believe we should all pray for the two boys and their families, their extended families, because something went wrong. Something has been going wrong, and only through prayer and guidance can we change this. All right. I get what she's saying, because she's right. Gerald Streb, his other friend, Stephen's other friend, said, I think when they reiterated that we have to pray for the whole city and everything that we're going through, truer words were never spoken. And the police made it a point to give this guy a funeral. And the police are shepherds of the community. They have to be. That's touching. Those are touching words. And I feel what he's saying. I feel what Gerald Streb was saying. I feel what they were all saying. You know, it hits me. And it hits me. Stephen Carl Amenhauser, I keep saying his full name because it's one we should not forget, was laid to rest at Riverside Cemetery on Lake Avenue. And the priest says the community effort taking place on this day will allow him to rest in peace. I struggle with all of this. I've mentioned it earlier that I'm generally not one to blame parents for the crimes committed by their children. But at some point, though, especially with kids 16 and 14 years old, the parents have to shoulder some responsibility, some ownership. If these boys weren't just slapped on the wrist after armed robberies, after stealing cars, if there were actual consequences dished out, Stephen might still be alive today. Gates Police Chief knows it. I'm sure the Rochester Police Department knows it. The priest, the bishop, and the friends and the hundreds of attendees at the service know it. So whose fault? Whose fault is this death? Okay. I'm just taking another moment here. I was going to regress here. I almost did. I did a little bit. I was going to spend a few minutes talking about government and failed new laws and parents and responsibility and kids, about differences in generations and the increase in violent crimes and burglaries and car thefts. But I think it was the feigned disbelief of Riley's mother that triggered me, that really set me off while researching this case. Her kid is bad. She knew it. The police knew it. The district attorney, the assistant district attorney, and the judge knew it. My guess, the Perry and Riley know it about themselves. They have to know it. No one needs to listen to me rant at the end of this episode. It's not necessary. I feel like I've pointed out everything I need to point out. Yes, with a lot of emotion, but hopefully that's what you're here for. Not just to get the case or the information, but the emotion, because I'm always full of it. Emotion. Anyway, there is a takeaway. No, let me put it this way. Is there a takeaway from all of this? Some glimmer of hope, some ray of light? Yeah, it's more of a question. Is there? I'd love to know. Right now, I don't see one, personally. I wish I could. I wish I could say, oh, well, things are turning in a different direction. Things are going to start getting better everywhere. I don't think that's true. I do have email. I do have ways you can comment and ask me questions, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on if there's some ray of light, or if there's something I'm missing, or if my take on this entire case is pointed in the wrong direction. Am I the one overreacting to this case? I don't know. I don't think I am. Stephen Amenhauser probably doesn't think I am either. But I do want to take a moment to remember him, and I'm going to. Thank you for listening to What Were They Thinking True Crime Podcast. As always, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. New episodes every Monday.